Hello and welcome to the third CND live broadcast since the lockdown began. Thank you for tuning in to listen to this discussion today. 2 weeks ago we had a very insightful discussion with Professor Paul Rogers about the impact of neoliberalism and our failure to respond adequately to the pandemic. That came a week after a campaign discussion, You Can't Nuke a Virus, with CND's Kate Hudson and Dave Webb. Today's programme is called Ventilators, Not Exterminators. And I should point out that we'll be making all of these programmes available on the CND website so that if you've missed a programme, you will still be able to catch up by watching the recording. Most of you will now have seen the news that the nuclear weapons contractor Babcock International has begun making 10,000 ventilators. The firm has factories in Scotland and southwest England, and it is expected that staff who routinely work on defence contracts have been redeployed to work on the ventilator project. Babcock is also refurbishing parts of Britain's Trident nuclear weapon system at Devonport Dock and is part of an alliance which manages the Royal Navy Armament Depot at Coulport and Faslane. And along with such redeployment, we are seeing major interventions by the state into the economy and huge demonstrations of public solidarity with NHS clinicians and carers and between citizens. It suggests now could be an opportunity for quite significant social and political change. Is there, the potential finally to confront the twin threats of nuclear warfare and climate change? And what can we learn from past attempts, like the Lucas Plan, for workers to plan and create opportunities for industrial conversion and redeployment, as well as defence diversification? Joining me to discuss these themes is Sam Mason, who is Policy Officer at PCS, covering climate justice, trade, digitalisation and automatum issues. She is also a member of the new Lucas Plan project and leads on the Just Transition Working Group Strand. Hello, Sam. Hi, Sam. And also joining me is Hilary Wainwright, who is the founding editor of Red Pepper. She is the co-author of a book on the Lucas Plan and has a new book out called A New Politics from the Left. Hello, Hilary.
Hi, Ian.
If any member of the audience today has a question for our speakers as the meeting progresses, please do submit your question via the text chat on Zoom or beneath the live stream on Facebook. So starting with you, Sam, I just wondered what your thoughts were on the recent changes we've seen since the lockdown began, particularly in relation to industrial conversion, defence diversification.
Okay, thanks, Ian. Sorry, I always forget to unmute myself on these things, so sorry for not saying hello earlier. And hello to everybody out there, and thank you very much for this invitation from CND. I mean, there's been a huge discussion since obviously the COVID crisis started about the nature of our society and economy and what's valued in it. And I probably should just start, for those who are not aware, PCS trade union, we're civil service trade unions. We do have members in the civilian defence sector, such as the MOD, but also with security guards, for example, at Faslane. So this is an issue, whilst it's obviously a wider sort of issue for us anyway as a trade union and part of the labour movement, but obviously directly for our members as well. But we are proud to be opposed to nuclear weapons and nuclear energy, and I like to say them both in the same sentence because of course nuclear energy and the civilian programme has an impact and is there to support the obviously nuclear defence programme as well. And I think clearly many issues have been raised and seen by the situation we're currently in, but I just wanted to step back a little bit, a couple of years, and I'll explain why I'm saying this. But I think some of you may remember in the 2017 election campaign when Jeremy Corbyn was being grilled on a BBC Question Time and by a studio audience demanding would he say whether he would press the nuclear button or not, and it got very, very false. And it was kind of only brought back to some rationality when there was a young woman in the audience who said, I don't understand why everyone in this room seems to be so keen on killing millions of people. And that thankfully did get a big cheer from the audience. But I think it's a really key point, because as you mentioned about the session that you had on you can't nuke a virus, obviously having nuclear weapons is completely useless in terms of the pandemic that we're facing. And even in terms of some of the jobs there that provide. And I think it's been really interesting that a lot of things have been completely turned on their head in these past few weeks, and many things that we've been calling for some time that we've always been told are not possible have suddenly become possible. Some of these are, as you mentioned, around the repurposing of some of our manufacturing for ventilators and other PPE. But I think, you know, it's been well said, but it's completely exposed as well the very precarious nature of our economy and of our society, and the fact that, you know, we've got incredibly under-resourced health and social care sectors, where we've both in staff and in terms of obviously the equipment that we've needed to help those workers and other workers that have had to continue out on the front line, if you like, during this time. But one thing I've been struck by as well, and I think we sort of need to come back to, is that a lot of the pandemic's been talked about in a kind of war vocabulary as well, which I think is really concerning. Because whilst there may be some parallels to sort of draw on about the reconstruction, obviously post World War II and creation of the welfare state and some of those things, I think unlike Francis O'Grady, the TUC this week saying we need a National Council of Reconstruction, I actually think we need to talk in terms of peace and remember our peace agenda, because we won't solve any of these issues with war. But return to our ideas around things about a defence diversification agency, looking at what we need in society, socially useful production, and things like a new Lucas plan to tackle those issues, those crisis issues of climate change and the nuclear threat, which is still there. And just to sort of perhaps just end on this point, I think it's worth reminding as well, obviously the atomic scientists put out, you know, we're 100 seconds to midnight at the moment with their last analysis, just showing how precarious and how close we are to civilization. And it's just completely crazy that, you know, where we've invested, and obviously the 105 billion pounds that's to be invested in the Trident renewal program could actually be spent on those kind of things that we need, and the billions that we're now seeing from the appearing magic money trees, which we weren't told were there, could actually be put towards, obviously not just obviously the very critical PPE and ventilators that we need at the moment, but the other kind of things that we need in society to actually, you know, deal with the issues of the gross inequality that we see in the precarious nature of most people's life, the housing problems, the failure in lack of dealing with public health issues in our education system, etc. So I think those are probably my initial comments for now. Thanks.
Thank you. And Hilary, you've been writing recently, haven't you, about industrial conversion in aerospace. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, I mean, because of my, similar to Sam, my long-term interest in conversion, arms conversion, and conversion from a high carbon economy to a low carbon economy, I kind of, my ears perked up when I heard about all this, conversion of Babcocks and so on. And I was really, kind of dismayed by the fact that, there was masses of sort of eulogy about these companies, the Ventilator Challenge, this consortium, a lot of talk about these companies, but nobody mentioned the workers, the people whose labour, is fundamental to the process of conversion. So we were clapping the health workers quite rightly, but not aware of the role of the engineers in this whole conversion to ventilators. So I eventually contacted Unite, who seemed to me the union that would be most involved. And sure enough, they were quite involved in this ventilator challenge at a national level. But I was also really interested in what was happening at the level of production, where, the role of the union, I imagine, would be crucial. And so through the Unite National Officer for Manufacturing, Steve Turner, I got in touch with the convener at Airbus in North Wales, Darren Reynolds, who then described to me the process and in great detail. And what he was basically showing is that the fact, it wasn't just that they were skilled, but also that they were organized, that the fact that they were a well-oiled, union, I won't say machine, but that's the metaphor, I suppose, that they were a well-organized group of workers, and the whole set of procedures had been negotiated so that any problems that came up went through a procedure that was then escalated if it wasn't sorted. So that meant that in the quite, disruptive, if you like, or at least potentially problematic process of conversion, everything was quite smoothly done because, the unions were well organized, the labor force was well organized. And so all the systems for sorting out particular problems, for sorting out health and safety, for example, they had a very strong network of health and safety, about 60 health and safety reps. This was for about 4,000 workers. So it was a almost fully unionized workforce. And so I think, we saw this that's taken place, and now they produced 1,000 ventilators last week, and there'll be more this week. And I think that it's interesting for the future because clearly with Zoom and so on, businesses are going to see the cost benefits of not sort of traveling, not having meetings, physical meetings. So there'll be a loss in that incredibly lucrative business air travel that air companies like British Aerospace and so on, British Airways, use as a subsidy effectively. So there'll be less demand for aircraft, hopefully. And so the fact that in a way the COVID crisis has been almost like a trial run. Somebody has referred to it as a drill for the climate emergencies that are likely to come if we don't make this conversion. So, I mean, I think at the moment the company and the unions are working very closely together, but clearly when it comes to the future and the company faces a fall in the demand for airplanes, the company capital can move to defence, to space. It's got, Airbus is a multi-product company. It's got a defence division, it's got a space division. And so, it can move capital, whereas workers are tied to a locality. And so you'll see a divergence of interest, and hopefully the unions will be ready now with alternative plans, not just for ventilators, because obviously the demand for ventilators will fall, but for kidney machines, for medical equipment, for all kinds of socially useful products on the Lucas kind of model. So I think it's an important experience, and I'll be producing an article for Red Pepper, so people can look out for that.
Great, thank you. So, Sam, we've mentioned the Lucas Plan a few times. That's a sort of historical example of workers being involved in planning for sort of industrial conversion. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing about the Lucas Plan, actually, I think, in Hilary actually being right there and producing the book on the Lucas Plan, obviously can add and probably say some other things as well. But for those who are not familiar with it, I mean, obviously the development of the Lucas plan was in response to job losses in Lucas Aerospace back in the 1970s. And I think what was really significant about the Lucas plan for me was what they called getting this shop stewards combined together across different unions and across the shop floor and different factories to come up with this alternative corporate plan, as it was called, which was actually produced in 1976, and we celebrated the anniversary of that in 2016, the 40-year anniversary, and which is where the project, which I'm involved in, the new Lucas Plan project, came out of. But I think what was important about that, but what kind of started off as a kind of typical sort of trade union response to defend workers' jobs within Lucas Aerospace, who had 50% of their contracts were within the defence sector, and obviously government contracts, that it actually brought the workers through thinking about what they actually did for their jobs and what they were producing. And this is where these ideas around socially useful production started to come through, at looking at how they could use their skills and innate knowledge to produce products that society actually needed. And Hilary referred there to things like kidney machines, and they were coming up with these products at the time, and sort of realizing that they looked around their outside world, outside of their workplace and in their communities and wider environment, that there were people dying because they didn't have kidney machines, and yet they were making these highly specialized products within the defense sector, that actually these skills could be transferred and repurpose the production lines to start making these socially useful things. And they actually did they canvassed across their membership to come up with products which they could produce. They came up with 150, I think it was, products in the end, and other ones included things like wind turbines, which seem absolutely tragic today when we're over 40 years on, and these are very much things we still need in society to address the climate change threats. But I think also what's important to remember, so I think there's a level of just how they organised and worked together and engaged with universities as well, although unfortunately they didn't get much response from the universities. But also they took that idea of socially useful production also into their work practices. So this was a time of sort of growing globalization, capitalization and automation of some of the functions and skills that they were doing, and starting to understand that actually these automative processes were starting to embody their own skills. So they looked as well about how things were produced, not just what was being produced, and sort of took this ideas throughout all of what they were doing. Now, unfortunately, I mean, they came up with a very wonderful plan, and I've got to say it wasn't accepted, obviously, by the company when they presented it. The trade union bureaucracies basically rejected taking it forward, and so did the Labour Party at the time. And but it just shows what can be achieved when workers combine together and use their own knowledge and skills, and have these kind of conversations in their workplace, some of which, that's not the only example, obviously, in history. That's probably industrially our most sort of famous one, which we talk about. But it did create a movement that came out of that. So, and it has remained a very poignant symbol. But unfortunately, it's often been something that we've never turned into a very clear industrial sort of framework or demand, if you like, in the wider labour movement, which I would hope that in our current context that is something we will start to be doing again, and in the light of obviously some of the things that Hilary's just spoken about with the ventilator challenge and Babcock, that it's not just something that's done for now in this immediate crisis, that these are ideas, and gives confidence that we can now challenge across the board about all the ways in which we are working and what is important in society, and the kind of give value to the jobs that we need to be doing, and who is important in society, who are the wealth creators, and who provides that fabric that enables us all to function, which we've very much seen as part of this crisis.
Thank you, Sam. Hilary, did you have any thoughts on what the lessons are from Lucas for our present sort of crisis and situation?
Well, Sam's summarised it very well. So I'm not much to add. I suppose one thing is highlighting the kind of the sense in which it was a new kind of trade unionism. You know, it was a trade unionism that looked beyond immediate wages and conditions and thought about the sort of social purposes of what they were producing. And that can be the result of many different circumstances. I mean, as Sam says, in the case of Lucas, it was redundancies being imposed by the company, and the workers, you know, particularly the skilled engineers and designers, saying, hang on, you know, our skills are not redundant, you know, we can see the needs internationally, you know, locally. I mean, it was often coming out of people's knowledge of, you know, friends of theirs or local neighbours or whatever who'd had medical problems or, you know, had children with disabilities. You know, they could see, as designers and engineers, they could see how their capacities could be used to solve those problems. So in that case, it was redundancies and a strong union, as Sam emphasises, the Combine Committee. In the case of the Airbus workers, it was the crisis, and in a way, you have a situation where actually management and unions had the same cause. So the problem of managerial prerogative, which was like the big problem, as Sam conveyed, that the Lucas workers faced, you know, where management, you know, even though actually the products were the kind of things that would in the future be quite profitable and have been for other companies, you know, what management was concerned about was relations of power, and they were just not prepared to see unions dictating or even proposing what they should be producing. But the key thing in both cases is that the union acted as a way of sharing the knowledge, the practical, what might be called tacit knowledge, things that you can't always write about and you know, codify, but are there in the skills that you exercise. And the union actually shared that knowledge through the design of new products, through, you know, in a way, the actual production of prototypes was key to the campaign. They actually, you know, developed the products through using the one or two universities that were sympathetic, and those became a sort of agitprop to the campaign to illustrate what was possible. So I think there are a lot of lessons for the kind of trade unionism that we need. I mean, a union like the PCS has already moved in that direction, you know, thinking about its members, not just as wage earners, but as knowledgeable producers. I mean, in their case, producers of a service. And you know, Unite involves many members and many officials who are beginning to think like that. And so, in a way, we need to see that. I mean, maybe, you know, because the unions are relatively weak because of the effects of Thatcherism and the deindustrialization and austerity. But I think what could be the key in the future is actually the role of the Labour Party and political campaigns like the new Lucas plan, so that the stimulus will come, you know, from the relationship between the sort of political thinkers and activists and representatives and union activists who are open to new ideas and can see the impasse of the present problems vis-a-vis climate change and disarmament.
Thank you, Hilary. Sam, what do you think about some of the other initiatives in recent years, like the you mentioned earlier, the Shadow Defence Diversification Agency? I mean, what was that, and where, you know, what's the sort of latest on that?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I suppose the latest, I mean, the ideas for Shadow Defence Diversification Agency have been around for quite a while. And, you know, and I think it is important to note that obviously the predecessor to Unite Union, Transport and General Workers Union, actually did a lot of work looking at arms conversion, defence diversification, wrote some very good papers about what kind of jobs could be created using the same kind of skills, etc. So there really is a lot of stuff out there on these ideas, and which was supported by the unions. But I think it's important to remember that I think one of the difficulties today of trying to have confidence again in that process kind of goes back because under the Blair government, they did, of course, create a defence diversification agency. But unfortunately, it wasn't what obviously we had been calling for. And it very much became a sort of privatised business to enable the industry to get products to market, which of course was not what we were talking about in terms of this agency for to create socially useful jobs and to move workers out of the defence sector. So, but that has, the ideas for that have very much been revived and kind of really coming out of this conference in 2016 in Birmingham, which was a really fantastic conference. I know we all like to say our conferences are a huge success, which of course they always are, but I think, you know, particularly for me, sort of being involved in the climate movement as well, it was quite an interesting space to have peace activists, environmentalists, political activists as well. And of course, you know, the original workers from the Lucas Aerospace who drew up this corporate plans. But coming out of that, we did successfully get a motion through TEC Congress in 2017, calling on to work with the Labour Party, calling on the TEC to work with the Labour Party to lobby for a shadow defence diversification agency. So that sort of policy is still there, and that's very much what we've been working towards these past couple of years. That hasn't progressed very far, I have to be honest. I mean, it was good that obviously Jeremy Corbyn created this role of shadow peace and disarmament minister, which Fabian Hamilton occupied, and Keir Starmer has now continued that within the new shadow cabinet, although I have to say that's not a cabinet position. So although Fabian was there, he was never actually within that whole sort of cabinet structure. So we did have meetings with Fabian to kind of progress some of these discussions, and we have outlined sort of ideas about what a defence diversification agency would do, which still exists. And I think it's very important that we continue to lobby for that, and particularly within the context of where we are now. So that's not diminished at all. But I think one of the things that we very sort of clearly moved towards, and again we will have to sort of revive these discussions, because we very much saw, whilst we saw this as a particular agency, that it would sit within that wider framework of an industrial strategy, or what was then being talked about in the Labour Party as the Green Industrial Revolution, or what we might talk about now in terms of the Green New Deal, and what some have called Green New Deal Plus, because the defence and militarisation side, very much here and in the US, and obviously in the US where it's far more significant, has been really left out of those discussions. So we're always having to try and sort of tack it on in some way. So I think we have to see this, whilst I think there are sort of very particular discussions to have around the defence sector, and through that conduit of developing a defence diversification agency, we have to also see that within the framework of the sort of wider sort of green industrial strategy, if you like, which we certainly need. And obviously, you know, post December 12th, we were all hoping these were the kind of conversations we'd be having today, not where we are now. But whilst obviously nobody wants a situation like COVID to make transformational changes that we need, clearly it does offer us an opportunity to really revisit some of these things, and you know, we have to grasp that and really push for it. So I think, you know, once it's, as we all know, in this kind of situation of lockdown, it's quite difficult to have some of these conversations, and part of you're just not having that sort of passing in the corridor snatches of things which, you know, can help with some of this. But you know, we have to make sure that we continue to build this discussion, and certainly within the trade union movement as well.
Thank you. Hilary, do you have any thoughts on kind of initiatives and practical things that we need to be getting involved in and supporting? It seems to me there's such an urgency, you know, around all of these issues, climate change and abolishing nuclear weapons. You know, the momentum, particularly of the climate change movement right now, surely these kind of arguments need to be absolutely central in going forward.
Yes, I mean, I just think after this crisis, and after the initiatives that people are already taking to address the urgent need now, there'll be a much greater openness to the conversion ideas, particularly in relation to climate change. But I think that'll easily move into the question of arms conversion. I mean, maybe we should have some discussion now. I can see on the chat people are wanting to discuss, so I'm happy to respond to people's ideas. I think we should crowdsource. Oh dear.
Okay.
Hang on. I'll just very quickly disappear, but let's have.
Okay. So I'm just going to have a look at some of our questions that were emailed in advance of the meeting today before I go to some of the ones that have been raised whilst we've been speaking. This is quite an interesting one from, I think it's Laura Warren. There have been media reports about contractors producing ventilators which have turned out to be unsuitable for treating COVID-19. Can we be confident that the ventilators produced by the weapons contractors are suitable for requirements, and what checks are in place to ensure upfront that the ventilators they produce will meet requirements? And I suppose what occurred to me when I read that question is that these kind of conversion efforts, they need to be really thought out and over a longer period of time than perhaps we're seeing in the current pandemic. What do you think about this, Sam?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, because there's been a scrabble. I mean, I don't know how closely people have followed this. Obviously, it's very good, you know, some of the conversion projects that are underway with ventilators, but as we know, the government has favoured some of their big businesses who really have no experience and have had to come up with new kind of blueprints for the ventilators. So they have fallen short of obviously what the health service needs at this time. And again, that's just one of the problems of just the competitive nature and the market-based nature of our economy, where we can't respond to a crisis like this on this basis, because of course we didn't have everything so sort of heavily patented and people want to, you know, get the maximum financial value out of everything. Then, you know, we would hopefully be sharing a lot of this stuff. And, you know, I think one of the things that bemused me in some of this, back towards the sort of end of March, I know all the UK embassies were told to source ventilators and PPE from the countries in which they were based, which is clearly taking resources out of those countries which are needed by those citizens, which, you know, is just a sort of crazy that, you know, we weren't all working and gearing up our own production, even the stuff that we've got from Turkey and the debacle of what happened over the weekend with the stuff coming in from there. So I think that is a sort of really big issue. So in terms of, yes, long-term conversion, that's why we really need to have a very coordinated plan for you know, the things that we need and how we produce them, and the repurposing obviously of our production for that. And that's why things like Defence Diversification Agency will probably look at the skills that are needed, the things that are required to be built and manufactured, and the products that are needed, and working with trade unions properly, and obviously with educational institutes, etc., that can actually develop these things, rather than this kind of quite chaotic way that we've seen in the past few weeks. It's hard to believe that's only just been a few weeks really through all of this, sort of where we are.
Yeah, thank you. Just whilst we wait for Hilary to return, some of our questions are kind of slightly more C&D oriented, you know, asking questions about our organisation and, you know, what we should be doing and how we should be positioning ourselves. So I'm just going to invite Kate Hudson to join us. Kate Hudson is C&D General Secretary. Can you hear us, Kate?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, we can't see you actually, so could you turn your camera on?
How do I do that? It's not giving me an option to do that.
Okay, well don't worry, we can perhaps manage without. I just wondered if I could...
give you an option at the beginning, shouldn't it?
Yeah. Okay, let's have a look at. There's just a couple of questions that are quite C&D related, Kate.
Far away.
Dylan Morris asks, I'm fully on board with the message of C&D and totally agree with the ventilators, not exterminators message. But is there any concern that the movement may be using the current epidemic to advance our own cause? Essentially, is there a way for us to tailor this message to make sure it comes across as palatable and accessible to those that may not already be on our side?
Well, absolutely. One doesn't want to look as though one's trying to kind of inappropriately piggyback on what is a terrible tragedy. Concerns that are being raised very, very widely across the board. I mean, everyone is saying we need more of our national resources to be allocated to the health service and to providing the correct material, but also dealing with other issues like the problem of homelessness and care workers. You know, so I think it's absolutely appropriate that we do say, well, look, the government has been highlighting the fact that pandemics are a big security risk for many years. How come they haven't been spending the appropriate amount of money on it? It's just common sense, and people have the right to know what government spending is going on and that it's being spent on the wrong priorities. So I think, yes, absolutely, we need to be sensitive and very aware to the human tragedy that's unfolding, but also really spelling out the government has to change its spending priorities, and that's part of our responsibility to do that.
And I also have a question from John Morris. He says, he's asked this question on a number of different sort of Zoom discussions, but hasn't been able to find out the answer yet. Are the people working on the Trident nuclear weapons system replacement seen as key workers doing essential work? What's their status at the moment?
Well, this is quite interesting because I've been following this by checking out the BAE Systems website to see what's happening at Barrow. And I was a bit disappointed earlier in the month, I think it's like end of the first week of April, to see that they were launching HMS Audacious, which is the latest in the series of astute submarines. That's nuclear powered but conventionally armed submarines. And they had a little statement saying that they were doing this in line with government health requirements and so on, but nevertheless they'd gone ahead and done that. But there was a fantastic report yesterday on the BBC's website about Barrow, and saying that workers there are producing specialised hooks which are necessary for hanging things in intensive care units. So they're producing those, but also they're producing the face masks, not the cloth ones, the visors, the plastic visors that are used in the health settings. And I think they produce tens of thousands of those. And in fact, some of them are working from home, producing those visors on 3D printers. So, and that's, BAE Systems, Barrow workers, they are the people who are making the subs. So they are now working on making the gear that the hospitals need. So that's great. So I don't know how they are defined. There's no statement about that, but they are being now put on to absolutely crucial, essential work.
Thanks, Kate. Hilary, Annie Tunnicliffe has asked us, and I think I know the answer to this question already, could we have the process that you've described at Unite, with Unite at Airbus, written up, because it would be a really useful resource for the movement?
Yes, no, I have written it up, and so I can, it'll be in Red Pepper, and next issue, which will be out at the end of the month, but also maybe we'll put it on our website. And if she gives me her email, I can send it immediately. Or she puts her email on the chat. Or I can give it to C&D too, because they might. Right. It's more relevant to climate change in that case, but it's the principle of conversion, I think, and the role of the union in facilitating it.
Great. And yeah, I mean, I think that's something we could certainly put on the CND website to make that widely available. I think, Sam, you touched maybe on some of this to do with the conferences. Ian Fairley, a CND supporter and a vice president of CND, he says, I seem to recall that in recent years, conferences were held to discuss the pioneering work of Ken Coates and the Lucas Aerospace plan, the Combined Union Committee in the 1970s. So I guess that I think conferences have taken place about the Lucas plan in recent years. I think you mentioned and have been involved in some of them. Have you got anything to say about Ken Coates?
Well, nothing to say about Ken Coates particularly, but perhaps in terms of conferences that have taken place. And hello, Ian, if you're still on the call. There had been, as I said, because we developed this new Lucas Plan project out of the 2016 conference, what we did try to do, I mean, obviously, as everyone knows, putting these conferences together are quite resource intensive. But we thought it was quite important to try and run events around the country, and obviously particularly outside of London and in some of the places that obviously where this is more sort of pertinent agenda. So it's a bit elaborately called really, but we've established this kind of series of road shows. So we had a number of events. Newcastle TEC held an event. We did one in Derby. So we've had several of those. We were planning one in London for this month, which of course we had to cancel. But we will be doing something online on May the 13th, more focused around not so much defence diversification, though of course we will touch on those, and Hilary will be involved in this as well, but sort of wide discussion around socially useful production and getting some comrades actually from Oshawa General Motors car plant in Canada who've been having these discussions as well, and recently came up with a feasibility study on how they could convert what is now largely a redundant car plant in Toronto into socially useful production. And they just put in a call to their government to use the plant to make ventilators. And just yesterday, actually, the Trudeau government announced that part of the plant will be used for some, I'm not quite sure if it's ventilators or PPE, but you know, you can never say how much this is a direct intervention from that group, but clearly that was quite a welcome piece of news for them. So we do very much want to continue with this, because obviously, you know, these ideas have got to be developed up, and you know, through the grassroots of the labour movement as well, and with the people who are actually doing these jobs and workers' engagement around these. So we will continue to do that, and once we can all get back out and into spaces we can share together again, and be in close proximity, obviously we'll be very keen to have these discussions. And I very much hope that now this is very live and real debate, and it hasn't been real before, but I think because people are very practically seeing what's happening and question again the kind of values of jobs and what's important in society, that there'll be a much wider engagement around some of these discussions.
I noticed one of the comments in the chat room is from Carol Turner, and she writes, glad the elephant in the Green Deal room is raised. Such a shame that military and nuclear weapons are so often missing from the debate. Code Pink in the US coined a simple and direct slogan we should think about popularizing here: war is not green. So I think it's a nice simple way of tying those two issues together, don't you think, Hilary? Hilary? We seem to have lost Hilary there. Kate?
Sorry. Yeah, no, I mean, exactly. No, that's a really good slogan, because it just points to the, well, obvious points that, you know, war is going to be destroying humanity and nature, and also, you know, the production of military equipment is a massively high carbon process, and the war economy. I mean, Britain still is a war economy. I mean, it is incredible, you know, after the end of Cold War, which was a very just big, that was the war. In fact, in some ways, in the US particularly, the war economy was key to the whole kind of development of the US economy and its boom period, and that's obviously affected the UK. So we have a war economy, which is also a high carbon economy, and so the process of conversion is about the conversion of socially useful products, which that means products for peace and for meeting social needs. So the two processes are absolutely bound up together. And also, in a way, the whole idea of workers and companies thinking critically about what is being produced, I think it applies to both climate change and war. And the way this crisis has led people to be very sort of aware of our interdependencies, and of labour, the nature of work. There's transport workers who are now being particularly affected by the pandemic, and it's made people, just very aware of in a way the nature of work. So all the clapping, it began health workers, then it became delivery workers and transport workers, and now it should be extended to.
Great, thank you, Hilary. Just before I ask Sam and Hilary, you both to sort of say a few final comments. Kate, there was just a final question, sort of C&D related question from Wendy Clow. Please, can we have some posters for our front room windows for these times when everyone is taking a look at their priorities and values? I still have my car sticker, NHS not Trident. I think this is a perfect opportunity to sell the C&D message. If you design the poster carefully with not too much ink, then people could simply print at home. I think that's a really good suggestion, don't you, Kate?
Absolutely. Thank you very much indeed, Wendy. Obviously, we can't get them printed and send them out because we're all working from home, but absolutely we can get some designed. We can put them on the website, and of course you can then just download them yourselves, just print them out. We'll do it in such a format that they can be printed out in black and white or colour. And then, yeah, that would be absolutely fantastic to have those messages up in your front windows in every street. Thank you very much for that suggestion.
Thanks, Kate. Sam, was there anything you felt in our discussion that we may have missed that you wanted to pick up on or summarise in sort of final remarks?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I think just a couple of things, and perhaps one thing I should have touched on, which I realised I didn't. I mean, in terms of the jobs in the defence sector, because obviously a lot of the discussion centres on the high skilled, they're well paid and sort of comfortable jobs in other sectors. And I just think it's good to be aware that obviously jobs have been declining massively in the defence sector because of capitalisation and the capital intensity of a lot of that work. And the Nuclear Education Trust did a really good report a couple of years ago analysing a lot of this, and sort of globally where there has been sort of defence diversification projects taking place, and including even in the US, which has based demobilisation programs. So there are possibilities obviously to support workers with social protections around pensions and pay and retraining, etc. So obviously they're very much things that we would talk about. I think the other thing at the moment, obviously there are jobs being shed at incredible rate within the oil sector, as we know, due to the fall in the oil price and plus COVID as well. So I think, that there's real sort of multiple crises happening across the board where jobs are being lost. And obviously in the UK, we've got a highly service-oriented economy now, and which obviously, interestingly, a lot of those jobs have been impacted because of the precarious nature of a lot of that work too. So we've got huge issues coming down the line, and we have to, be thankful for Rishi Sunak for being so honest that we've got severe hardship ahead to look forward to. And I think we all know what that's going to translate into. Doesn't take too many guesses. So I think we have to bear these things in mind, and that's why these kind of conversations are so important, and that we start shaping how we continue to sort of pass through this COVID crisis, because clearly it's going to go on for some time yet, and the kind of world that we want to live in, and those very things that we thought weren't possible just a few weeks ago. And clearly we've seen where money can be redirected towards, that we make sure the world that we want now becomes possible, because this may just be our last best opportunity to do that.
I've lost I
You
can't
have
hear.
final comments to make, Hilary.
Oh, well, just very quickly, I I think everybody else has covered things, but maybe a whole issue of work itself. I don't think maybe when I was out or
We just seem to be having a slight connection issue with you there, Hilary. Sorry about that. So I'm just going to move on if that's okay. I'm really sorry about that. I just want to say a brief thing about our next meeting. Just to say that most of you will know about one of the most important nuclear treaties, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It came into force in 1970 following widespread international concern about the risk of nuclear weapons proliferation and the spiralling nuclear weapons stocks of those states that had developed them. This treaty bound its signatories to general and complete nuclear weapons disarmament. The NPT, as it's known, was due to be reviewed this year, but the review conference has been postponed because of the coronavirus. CND was due to host a fringe meeting at the United Nations on the review conference. So we've decided instead, because we can't go ahead with that anymore, we're going to hold that meeting online. And we're going to hold that on Tuesday at 4 o'clock. We have named the session, Will Britain Honour its NPT Commitments and Disarm? And we will be joined by Jeremy Corbyn, MP, Bill Kidd, MSP, peace activist Rebecca Johnson, and Ambassador Aidan Liddell. So do join us for that discussion. You'll be able to watch live on Facebook as you are today, or we'll also be sending out registration details by email after this programme in case you'd like to watch on Zoom. I'd also like to encourage anyone watching who isn't already a member to join CND. As I'm sure you'll be aware, it's a difficult time for campaign organisations, so your support and solidarity at the moment would be really appreciated. Please join us. And thank you very much. I want to thank my guests for joining us today. Sam Mason from the PCS Union. Thanks, Sam. And I also want to say thank you, Hilary. You've all put yourselves on mute. And thanks, Kate, also for joining us to answer those questions about CND. We'll be taking some of those ideas forward after this meeting. And yeah, thank you everyone for tuning in today. Very much look forward to seeing you on Tuesday, and we'll be doing more of these programs very imminently, and we'll announce details of those soon. So thank you everyone very much.
Thank you.
Thank
you. Thank you, Ian. Thank you, CND.
Bye.
Bye.